Street View shows a van parked behind an abandoned building, missing since 2001. The stale air in the cold case unit tasted of forgotten coffee and regret. Detective Miles Corbin scrolled through Google Street View with the absence of a man waiting for a train that was never coming. It was a habit he'd picked up, a form of digital archaeology, tracing the ghost arteries of a city that had forgotten more than it remembered. He wasn't looking for anything. That was the point. When you were looking, you never found it. The universe was a shy animal. You had to pretend to be asleep for it 2 inches closer. His mouse clicked. A tiny plastic heartbeat in the morgue-like quiet of the precinct basement. Click, forward, click, turn left. He was miles from anything relevant, cruising through a blighted, industrial wasteland on the city's forgotten southern edge. Weeds grew like green tumors from cracks in the pavement. The buildings were skeletal, their windows like vacant eye sockets, staring into nothing. It was a landscape of failure, a place where dreams came to die and be picked over by scavengers. He navigated the little digital avatar, the Pegman, down a street called Sparrow Creek Lane. The name was a cruel joke. There were no sparrows, no creek, just rust-colored fences and the ghosts of factories. He'd been working the Lily Ann Parker case for 6 years, unofficially. It was a fossil, a file so cold it gave off a frost you could feel in your bones. Lily, 17, vanished on September 10, 2001. She and her B2Hell 1993 Ford Econoline van, a hideous shade of seafoam green she'd lovingly named the Albatross, had simply evaporated from the face of the earth. The next day, the world had burned. 2 towers fell, and the sky rained ash and paper. In the global cataclysm that followed, the disappearance of one girl in a nowhere town became less than a whisper, less than a footnote. She was a runaway, they'd decided. The case was closed before it was ever truly opened. Her parents, a mechanic and a diner waitress, had screamed and pleaded and begged, but their grief was a flickering candle in a hurricane. They had no money, no influence. They were just 2 more broken people in a world that was shattering around them. Miles had been a rookie then, fresh-faced and full of a fire that had long since been banked to embers. He'd seen the injustice, the casual dismissal of a life, and it had planted a splinter in his soul that he could never quite dig out. Click. He turned the virtual camera down an alley he'd never seen before, a dirt track that ran behind a derelict brick warehouse, the kind of place you only went if you were dumping a body or shooting up. The Google car had been brave to go down here. The image quality degraded slightly, the pixels stretching like cheap fabric. Weeds clawed at the sides of the building. A mattress, stained with unknowable sins, lay rotting in a heap. And then he saw it. His breath hitched. It wasn't a gasp. It was a complete system failure. The air caught in his throat, a solid, painful lump. His heart, which had been beating a slow funereal rhythm, suddenly kicked like a mule against his ribs, tucked away behind the far corner of the warehouse. Half hidden by a skeletal leafless tree, was a van. An old Ford Econoline. The paint was bleached by decades of sun and neglect. But even through the digital grime and the pixelated haze, he could see it. A pale, sickly green, seafoam. No, he whispered to the empty room. The word was a puff of air, devoid of sound. His hand, the one on the mouse, began to tremble. It was a violent, uncontrollable tremor, starting in his fingertips and racing up his arm. With a jerky, spastic movement, he zoomed in. The image blurred, then resolved again into a slightly clearer, more horrifying picture. The distinctive rust spot on the rear fender, shaped like a weeping eye. The Grateful Dead sticker, faded to a blue and red ghost, still clinging to the corner of the back window. The dent on the driver's side door from where Lily's father had backed into it with his pickup truck 2 weeks before she vanished. It was the Albatross. The screen seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The image was dated in the bottom right corner. Image captured, May 2024, last month. For 23 years, this van, this metal tomb, had been sitting here, in this forgotten, piss-stained alley, less than 5 miles from the mall where Lily had last been seen. It had been Here, while he'd been chasing down dead-end leads in other states. It had been here while Lily's mother slowly drank herself to death, and her father withered into a hollow-eyed ghost who still changed the oil in her car that wasn't there. A wave of nausea washed over him. He felt the sting of bile at the back of his throat. The injustice of it was a physical force, a lead weight pressing down on his chest, cracking his ribs. They hadn't even looked. The original detectives, fat and lazy, and already thinking about their pensions, had driven right past this street. They had sipped their coffee and eaten their donuts and declared her a runaway because it was easier. Because the next day, the world gave them a bigger monster to hunt, and a teenage girl in a seafoam green van was no longer important. He could feel the powerlessness of Lily's parents as if it were his own. He saw their faces in his mind, worn down by grief and official indifference. He remembered Mrs. Parker, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, shoving a flyer with Lily's smiling face into his own, her eyes pleading. She wouldn't run, she'd said, her voice cracking. She's a good girl. Someone took our girl. And he, a rookie, had just nodded and said the things he was supposed to say. We're doing everything we can, ma'am. It was a lie. They were doing nothing. And he had been a part of it. He had been a silent, uniformed accomplice to the slow, bureaucratic murder of Hope. His fingers, clumsy and shaking, fumbled for the keyboard. He typed the address into a separate search bar. The warehouse was the old Blackwood Textiles factory, closed in '98. A shell, a magnet for vagrants and copper thieves. For 23 years he leaned back in his chair, the cheap pleather groaning. In protest, the silence of the room was different now. It was accusatory. It was filled with the ghost of a girl who had waited and waited and waited. Had she been in the van? Had she died in there? Had she screamed for help while the world was distracted by falling towers and flags waving on every porch? The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. He imagined her, alone in the dark, the smell of stale upholstery and her own fear. How long had she been alive? Hours, days. The alley was a perfect sound trap. No one would have heard her. No one would have known. A cold rage, pure and clean and diamond-hard, began to crystallize in his chest. It burned away the nausea, the shock. It focused him. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was a desecrated grave. It was a monument to a world that had looked away. He didn't call dispatch. He didn't call his captain. This was his. The universe had dropped this horror in his lap, and he would not share it. Not yet. Not until he had stood on that ground and breathed that air. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, his keys from the bowl on his desk. The jingle of the metal was obscenely loud in the quiet room. His heart hammered against his sternum, a frantic prisoner demanding release. He walked, not ran, out of the basement, up the stairs, and into the blinding afternoon sun. He didn't sign out. He didn't speak to anyone. He was a man possessed, a ghost on a mission. The drive was a blur. The city slid past his windows, a meaningless collage of brick and glass. He saw people laughing, talking on their phones, living their lives, and he hated them for it. He hated their ignorance, their blissful unawareness of the tomb that had been sitting in their midst for 2 decades. He turned onto Sparrow Creek Lane. It was even more desolate in person. The asphalt was a patchwork of repairs and potholes. He slowed the car, his breath held tight in his chest. He saw the alley. It was there, just as it was on the screen, a dark, uninviting gash between the derelict warehouse and a crumbling concrete wall. He pulled the car to the curb, the engine ticking as he shut it off. The silence that rushed in was heavy, oppressive. He could hear his own blood roaring in his ears. For a moment, he just sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He was afraid. He was terrified of what he would find, and even more terrified of what he wouldn't. Finally, he opened the door. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. He walked toward the mouth of the alley, his shoes crunching on loose gravel. His service weapon felt heavy on his hip, a cold, useless comfort. He stepped into the alley. The light dimmed. The walls of the buildings seemed to lean in, blocking out the sky. He saw the mattress, its springs bursting through the stained fabric like broken ribs. He saw the skeletal tree. He saw the spot where the van should have been, and there was nothing. Just an empty space. The ground was soft, muddy from a recent rain, and in the mud, stark and clear and fresh, were two sets of tire tracks, deep gouges, leading from the spot where the albatross had been, out of the alley, and onto the street. They were fresh. Hours old, maybe a day at most. Miles stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. It was gone. He had found it, a 23-year-old ghost, only to have it vanish again. He dropped to one knee, the dampness of the ground seeping through his trousers. He touched the edge of the track. The mud was still soft. Someone had been here. Someone had seen the Google car, just as he had. Someone had realized their secret was about to be exposed to the world with a click of a mouse. Someone who had kept that van hidden for 23 years had come back and moved it. He stood up, a low guttural sound escaping his lips. It was a sound of pure, undiluted fury. He was too late. He was 23 years and 24 hours too late. He looked around the alley, his gaze frantic, desperate. He saw a glint of something in the weeds, near where the van's passenger door would have been. He moved toward it, his heart starting to pound again with a new, terrible hope. He knelt, pushing aside the thorny branches and grasping weeds. It was a small silver object, tarnished with age and dirt. He picked it up, rubbing the grime away with his thumb. It was a locket, heart-shaped on the front. Tarnished but still legible, was a single engraved initial .L. He pried it open with his thumbnail. The tiny hinges creaked in protest. Inside, protected from the elements for all these years, were two miniature photographs. On one side, a smiling, middle-aged couple, the mechanic and the waitress, younger, happier. On the other side, a girl with bright, hopeful eyes and a wide, braces smile. Lillian Parker. He closed his eyes, the silver locket cold against his palm. The cliffhanger wasn't that the van was gone. The cliffhanger was that for the first time in 23 years, he had proof. Proof she hadn't run. Proof she had been there. And proof that her killer was still out there, still watching, still one step ahead. The game had just been reset. And this time, he wasn't a rookie. This time, it was personal. He could feel her, a cold whisper in the desolate alley. "Find me," she seemed to say. "Find him." The weight of the locket was the weight of a promise. He had let her down once. He would not do it again. He would tear the city apart, brick by brick, until he found the man who had moved that van. He would find him, and he would make him pay for every one of the 8,401 days that Lily had been missing. The hunt had begun. Lillian Parker was 17, but she carried the soul of an old-timey poet. She saw beauty in rust, in peeling paint, in the sad, forgotten corners of the world. Her diary, a cheap, spiral-bound notebook with a kitten on the cover, wasn't filled with crushes and gossip. It was filled with odes to water towers and elegies for fallen leaves. She was a creature of intense, quiet feeling in a world that preferred its girls loud and shallow. Her greatest love, besides her parents, was the albatross. The seafoam green van was her kingdom, her chariot, her sanctuary. It smelled of patchouli, gasoline, and the cheap vanilla air freshener that hung from the rearview mirror. It was where she wrote, where she dreamed, where she felt most herself. On September 10, 2001, she was supposed to be at the mall, meeting friends to see a movie. But she'd taken a detour. She was always taking detours, chasing a line of light, a peculiar shadow, a story only she could see. Her parents, Frank and Mary Parker, were simple people, their hands calloused and their hearts worn on their sleeves. Frank was a mechanic, a man who spoke the language of engines and grease. He could diagnose a faulty alternator by its sound alone. But he couldn't decipher the quiet melancholy in his own daughter's eyes. He loved her with a fierce, protective silence, a love expressed in oil changes and new tires. Mary was a waitress at the 24-hour highway diner, a woman whose life was a series of small, kind gestures, a warm coffee refill, An extra slice of pie, a patient ear for a lonely trucker. She saw the poetry in Lily, and it scared her. She wanted her daughter to be safe, to be normal, to walk a path that was paved and well lit. But she knew Lily was destined for the unpaved roads. When she vanished, their world didn't just break, it atomized. Frank retreated into the garage, working until his knuckles bled, trying to fix the one thing that was irrevocably broken. Mary began to keep a bottle of cheap whiskey under the sink, her kindness curdling into a brittle, simmering anger. They became two islands of grief. Separated by a sea of unspeakable loss, the antagonist was not a monster in the traditional sense. He was a man who wore a mask of absolute normalcy. Arthur Blackwood was a pillar of the community, a real estate developer who had inherited his family's failed textile empire and transformed its rotting assets into profitable ventures. He was in his late 30s in 2001. Handsome in a bland, forgettable way, with a politician's smile and eyes that revealed nothing. He was married, 2 kids in private school, a member of the local country club. He donated to charities. He sponsored the Little League team. His public face was impeccable. But behind the facade was a hollow man, a man filled with annoying emptiness that he could only fill with control. He craved power, not the loud, overt kind, but the secret, absolute power over another person's fate. He collected secrets the way other men collected stamps. The abandoned textile factory, his father's greatest failure, was his private kingdom, a place where the rules of the world outside did not apply. He would go there sometimes, just to walk the silent cavernous floors, to feel the weight of its decay, to be the king of a dead empire. It was his sanctuary of rot, and then there was the hidden witness. A boy named Kevin, Kev Mulligan. In 2001, Kev was 15, a ghost in his own life. He was a foster kid, bounced from one indifferent home to another. His only solace, the small, feral colony of stray cats he cared for in the alley behind the Blackwood textiles factory. He was invisible. People looked through him, past him. He had learned to make himself small, to move without a sound, to observe without being observed. The alley was his turf, his only home. He knew every loose brick, every patch of weeds. He knew the cats by name: Patches, Shadow, Ginger. They were his family. He was there on September 10th, hidden in his usual spot behind the overflowing dumpster. When he saw the seafoam green van pull into the alley, he'd noticed the girl driving. She had a kind face. She wasn't supposed to be there. The scene unfolded like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Lily had parked the Albatross, notebook in hand, drawn by the stark industrial beauty of the decaying factory. She was sketching the way the rust on a fire escape bled down the brick wall. She was in her own world. Kev watched, curious. He was used to junkies and vagrants. She was different. She was light. Then Arthur Blackwood's car, a pristine black Lexus, had pulled silently into the other end of the alley, blocking the only exit. Blackwood got out. He wasn't wearing his country club blazer. He was in a simple work shirt and jeans, but he moved with an unnerving authority. "This is private property," Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the quiet air like a razor. Lily jumped, startled. She clutched her notebook to her chest. "Oh, I'm so sorry, I thought the building was beautiful." Kev saw the flicker in Arthur's eyes. It was a look he'd seen before, in the eyes of a cruel foster father, in the eyes of a dogfighter he'd once seen in a park. It was the look of a predator who had just spotted a rare, beautiful bird with a broken wing. "Beautiful," Arthur repeated, taking a step closer. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Most people see a ruin. You see beauty. You're an artist." "I try," Lily said, a shy smile touching her lips. She was disarmed by his apparent interest. She was used to being seen as strange. He was making her feel special. "I own this place," Arthur said, gesturing to the factory. "My father built it. It's a sad story, a story of failure." He walked closer still, his voice dropping to a confidential, intimate tone. "Would you like to see inside? See the ghosts?" Kev's stomach clenched. Every instinct in his skinny, underfed body screamed, "Run!" He wanted to shout, to throw a rock, to do something. But fear was a cage. He was a ghost. Ghosts don't intervene. He was terrified of Arthur, of this calm, smiling man who radiated a cold, dark energy. Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second. A flicker of doubt, but her curiosity, her artist's soul, won out. "Really?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I would love that." "Of course," Arthur said, his smile widening. He gestured toward a small rusted side door. "The main entrance is sealed, but I have a key to this one. It's our little secret." Kev watched, his heart pounding against his ribs, as Arthur led Lily to the door. He watched as Arthur unlocked it and held it open for her. He watched as she stepped across the threshold, out of the light and into the darkness of the factory. He watched as Arthur followed her in, pulling the heavy metal door shut behind them. The click of the lock was the loudest sound Kev had ever heard. He sat behind the dumpster, paralyzed for what felt like an eternity. The alley was silent again, except for the soft meow of a kitten rubbing against his leg. He never saw Lillian Parker again. He saw Arthur Blackwood emerge about an hour later, alone. He was calm. He got into his Lexus and drove away. The seafoam green van remained. Kev ran. He ran from the alley, from the cats, from the memory of the girl's trusting smile. He ran and never looked back. He was a ghost, and he had just seen another ghost being made. For 23 years, that secret festered inside him. He aged out of the foster system, drifted from one dead-end job to another, haunted by the click of that lock. He was a man living in a perpetual twilight, terrified of the darkness he carried within him. He never told a soul who would believe him, a foster kid, a nobody, accusing Arthur Blackwood, the king of the city. They would have crushed him. So he stayed silent, a hidden witness to a murder that the world had forgotten. The guilt was a constant low-grade fever, a sickness in his soul that never broke. He was as much a prisoner of that day as Lily was. The locket felt like a burning coal in Miles Corbin's pocket. For 2 weeks, he lived a double life. By day, he was the plotting, methodical detective, sifting through the digital dust of the 23-year-old case file, pretending to be starting from scratch. He re-interviewed ancient witnesses who remembered nothing. He re-examined evidence that had been contaminated by time and neglect. He performed the theater of a standard investigation for his captain, a political animal named Walsh who cared more about headlines than justice. Walsh saw the reopened Parker case as a potential PR win, a heartwarming story of a dedicated cop finally solving a local mystery. He had no idea of the rot Miles had uncovered. "Make it clean, Corbin," Walsh had said, clapping him on the back. "Find the runaway, bring her home for a tearful reunion. The local news will eat it up." Miles had just nodded, the locket, a cold, hard secret against his thigh. A tearful reunion. The sheer ignorant cruelty of it almost made him confess everything, but he couldn't. The moment he mentioned the van, the fresh tracks, the locket, he would lose control. It would become a media circus. The man who had moved the van would burrow deeper, disappear completely. This had to be done in the dark. By night, Miles became a hunter. He used his own time, his own gas, his own sanity. He started with the alley. He spent hours there, combing every inch of the blighted ground. He found nothing more. The killer had been careful, but the location itself was a clue. The van hadn't been dumped in a lake or buried in the woods. It had been hidden in plain sight, on property owned by Blackwood Textiles. Arthur Blackwood. The name was there in the original file, a footnote. He'd been questioned, briefly, in 2001, a formality. He was the property owner. He'd provided a rock-solid alibi, a charity luncheon across town, with a dozen influential witnesses. He'd expressed sympathy, offered a donation to the search fund, and been dismissed as a person of interest. It was too perfect. Miles started digging into Arthur Blackwood's life. Not the polished, public version, but the one hidden in the cracks. He pulled financial records, property deeds, phone logs. He spent his nights parked down the street from Blackwood's sprawling mansion in the gated community of Oak Ridge. Watching the warm lights glow in the windows, he saw the perfect family. Arthur, his elegant wife, his 2 college-aged children. Home for the summer, they looked like a family from a catalogue. It made Miles's skin crawl. The injustice of it was a physical ache. Frank and Mary Parker had lost everything. Their daughter was gone. Their hope had curdled into despair. Their lives had been reduced to a long, slow waiting for an end that would never come. And Arthur Blackwood, the man Miles was now certain was the killer, had thrived. He had built an empire on the foundations of his father's failure. His life a monument to success, all while Lily's bones lay somewhere cold and forgotten. He decided to visit Mary Parker. Frank had died of a massive coronary 3 years prior, a heart that had finally given out from the strain of carrying an ocean of grief. Mary lived alone in the same small house, a house that had become a shrine to a ghost. He found her on the porch, staring at the overgrown lawn. She was thin, fragile, her face a roadmap of sorrow. A half-empty glass of what smelled like gin sat on the railing beside her. "Detective," she said, her voice a dry rasp. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "Come to tell me you've found another dead end." "No, ma'am," Miles said gently. "I'm reopening the case, officially." A flicker of something not hope, but a bitter, weary curiosity passed through her eyes. "Why, after all this time, you all wrote her off? A runaway?" The word was a curse on her tongue. "We were wrong," Miles said, the admission costing him more than she could know. "I was wrong. I'm looking at everything again. Everyone." He paused. "I need to ask you about the day she disappeared. Was there anyone new in her life? Anyone she was afraid of?" Mary gave a short, harsh laugh. "Afraid? Lily wasn't afraid of anything. That was the problem. She was too trusting. She saw good in everyone, even when it wasn't there." She took a long swallow of her drink. "She was an artist. She loved old, broken things, said they had more stories to tell." The words sent a chill down Miles's spine. Old broken things. Like a derelict factory. "Did she ever mention the old Blackwood Textiles factory?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Mary's eyes narrowed. "That old dump. Why would she go there?" Then she paused, a memory surfacing. Wait, the week before, she was excited. She said she'd found the most beautiful, tragic place. She was going to draw it. She called it, The Fallen King. The Fallen King. It was exactly what a girl like Lily would call it. She went there. Miles said, his voice barely a whisper. Mary stared at him, her gin-fueled haze beginning to clear, replaced by a dawning horror. "What are you saying?" He couldn't tell her about the van. Not yet, it would be too cruel. "I think the man who owns that property might have been the last person to see her." Blackwood, Mary breathed. The name like poison. The rich man. He came here, you know, after. Gave us money. Said he was sorry for our loss. Her face contorted in a mask of disgust. He looked us in the eye. He had his picture taken with the mayor for the search party. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. The antagonist wasn't just a killer. He was a performer, a sadist who fed on the grief of his victims. He hadn't just hidden the body. He had reveled in the aftermath, basking in the glow of his own feigned compassion. Miles's next move was to find the witness. If Blackwood was this careful, this arrogant, there had to be a mistake somewhere, a loose thread. He went back to the original witness statements, the canvas of the area around the mall. Where Lily was last seen, it was all useless. But the alley, The alley was different. It wasn't on the way to anywhere. The only people who went there were locals, transients. He spent days talking to the homeless population in the area, showing Lily's picture. They were ghosts too, people the world had forgotten. They looked at him with suspicion and fear, but one of them, an old man with eyes clouded by cataracts and cheap wine, remembered something. "Don't know the girl," he'd rasped. "But I know the alley. That was Kev's spot." "The cat kid, Kev?" Miles asked. "Yeah, skinny kid. always feeding the strays. He was there every day. Then one day, poof, gone. Right around the time the world went crazy, never saw him again. A name Kev, the cat kid. It wasn't in any official report. He was a ghost, a witness no one had ever known existed. Miles ran the name through every database he could access. Foster records, juvenile offenses, social services, and he found him. Kevin Mulligan. A long string of foster homes, petty theft, a life lived in the margins, and a current address. A rundown apartment complex on the other side of town. He found Kev Mulligan working the night shift at a 24-hour car wash, a place that smelled of chemical soap and despair. He was in his late 30s now, but he still had the look of a scared, skinny kid. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting, as if expecting a blow at any moment. Miles approached him, badge in hand. Kevin Mulligan. Kev flinched, his whole body tensing. I didn't do nothing. I'm not here to arrest you, Miles said, softening his voice. I want to ask you about something that happened a long time ago. In an alley off Sparrow Creek Lane. The color drained from Kev's face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. His eyes, wide with a terror that was 23 years old, were locked on Miles's. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, turning away. Grabbing a rag and furiously wiping down a car that was already clean. I'm talking about the cats, Miles said quietly. Patches, Shadow, Ginger. I'm talking about the girl in the green van. Kev dropped the rag, his hands were shaking. He looked at Miles, his face a mixture of terror and a strange, heartbreaking relief. The secret was too heavy, and he had been carrying it for too long. You can't, he whispered, his voice trembling. You can't go after him. He's not a man. He's something else. He'll destroy you. He'll destroy me. Who? Miles pressed, his heart pounding. Who are you talking about? The man in the Lexus, Kev choked out, tears welling in his eyes. The man who owned the factory. The man who smiled at her. The fear in Kev's eyes was real. It was primal. Blackwood hadn't just killed Lily. He had terrorized this boy into 2 decades of silence with a single look. The injustice escalated. It wasn't just a murder anymore. It was the systematic destruction of multiple lives. Lily was dead. Her parents were broken. And Kev Mulligan had been living in a prison of fear his entire adult life. Miles knew he had his witness. But he also knew that Kev was terrified, fragile. Blackwood would crush him on a witness stand. He needed more. He needed something that couldn't be intimidated, something concrete. He put a light tail on Blackwood, using off-duty cops he trusted, guys who owed him favors. For a week, they saw nothing. Blackwood went from his mansion to his office, to the country club. He was a portrait of boring, respectable success. But then, one night, Blackwood deviated. He didn't go home. He drove his new Lexus, a sleek silver model, out of the city, toward the old industrial sector. He drove to a self-storage facility, a new-looking place with bright orange doors and high-tech security. He used a keycard to get through the gate. The cop on tail, a young detective named Rivas, watched from a distance, his heart in his throat. He called Miles. He's here, at Securistore. He's opening one of the units. Which one? Miles demanded, his voice tight. Can't see the number from here, but he's backing his car up to it. He's hooking up a trailer. A trailer. The word exploded in Miles's mind. Rivas, do not lose him, Miles commanded, already grabbing his keys, his body electric with adrenaline. Whatever you do, do not lose him. Blackwood was moving the van. Again, he was getting bolder, more reckless. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he had outrun the ghosts. But he didn't know that one of them was a detective with a locket in his pocket and a promise to keep. The conflict was escalating from a quiet, secret hunt into a direct confrontation. The monster was on the move. And Miles was right behind him. The secure store facility was a maze of identical orange doors. A sterile, anonymous place designed for secrets. Miles arrived 20 minutes after Rivas's call, his unmarked sedan skidding to a halt a block away. He found Rivas parked in the shadows, his eyes glued to the facility's exit. "He's still in there," Rivas said, his voice tense. "Unit is in the back, C block. I saw him for a second under the lights. He was struggling with a winch, pulling something heavy onto a flatbed trailer. It had to be the van. Blackwood had moved it from the alley to this temporary tomb, and now he was moving it again. Why? The renewed police interest must have spooked him more than Miles had realized. He was cleaning house, erasing the last physical trace of his crime. "He's coming out," Rivas hissed. The automatic gate of the storage facility slid open. Arthur Blackwood's silver Lexus emerged, pulling a long, covered flatbed trailer. The shape under the heavy gray tarp was unmistakable. It was high, boxy. It was the Albatross. "Stay on him," Miles ordered into his own radio, speaking to the two other chase cars he'd scrambled. "Full surveillance. I want to know where he eats, where he sleeps, where he breathes. But do not, under any circumstances, make a stop. We don't have enough. A judge would laugh us out of court." For the next 72 hours, they tailed Arthur Blackwood in a nerve-steadying ballet of surveillance. The man was meticulous. He drove the trailer not to a remote forest or a scrapyard, but to another of his properties, a vast gated commercial lot on the outskirts of the state, slated for a future development. He unhitched the trailer in the center of the empty asphalt expanse, leaving it there like a strange, modern art installation, and drove away. He was hiding it in plain sight again. The arrogance was staggering. Miles felt a gnawing frustration. He had the witness, he had the van, but he had no body. He had no confession. He had nothing that directly tied Arthur Blackwood to the moment of Lily's death. Kev Mulligan's testimony was powerful, but a high-priced lawyer would paint him as an unreliable, traumatized drifter. The van was circumstantial. Blackwood could claim he'd just found it on his property and was moving it. It was a legal quagmire. He needed something more, a plot twist, a hidden clue that would shatter Blackwood's perfect facade. He decided to take a massive gamble. He went back to Cav. He found him in his small, grim apartment. The air was thick with the smell of cat food and fear. "He moved it, didn't he?" Kev asked, his face pale. He'd seen the news reports about the reopened case. "He knows you're coming." "Yes," Miles said, "and I need your help. I need you to think back, Kev, to that day. Every single detail, the van, the car, the man. Was there anything else? Anything he dropped? Anything he touched?" Kev shook his head, his eyes squeezed shut as if trying to block out the memory. "No, I don't think so. I was hiding. I was so scared, it's all a blur." "Think," Miles pressed, his voice gentle but firm. "After he came out of the factory, alone, what did he do? Did he just get in his car and leave?" Kev's brow furrowed. In concentration, he stood there for a minute, by the van, the green van. He had something in his hand. A rag, maybe. He wiped the door handle. The driver's side, of course, wiping his prints. And then he looked round, like he was making sure no one saw him. His eyes, they scanned the whole alley. "I thought he saw me. I swear, I thought he was looking right at me." Kev was trembling now, reliving the terror. "And then what, Kev? This is important." He walked over to the dumpster. "The one I was hiding behind." Kev's voice dropped to a whisper. He had a bag. A small trash bag, like from a bathroom. He tossed it in. Then he got in his car and drove away. Miles felt a jolt, a surge of pure, unadulterated hope. He threw something away. "In the dumpster, yeah," Kev said, opening his eyes. They were filled with a dawning realization. A little white bag. I didn't think nothing of it at the time. There was always trash in there. A trash bag. A bag with something inside he wanted to get rid of, but not something he wanted to carry with him. Something from the factory, something from Lily. It was the longest of long shots, a 23-year-old dumpster. The contents would have been hauled to a landfill a week later, buried under 2 decades of city garbage. It was gone. It was Impossible, unless... Miles' mind raced. The alley was private property. The city sanitation department wouldn't have serviced it. The dumpster belonged to the factory. It would have been emptied by a private company. Or, if the factory was truly derelict, it might not have been emptied at all. But vagrants, scrappers, they would have picked it clean. Kev, Miles said, his voice electric with a crazy idea. Did anyone ever empty that dumpster? Kev thought for a moment. I don't think so, not officially. Sometimes scrappers would come by and pull out metal, but they never took the garbage. It just ... piled up. It was always overflowing. It was still impossible. But it was the only thread he had. He went back to the precinct, his mind on fire. He couldn't request a full-scale excavation of a landfill based on a vague memory from a terrified witness. Walsh would have him committed. He needed to do this himself. He started with old city records, looking for sanitation contracts for Blackwood. Textiles, as he suspected, they had been cancelled in 1998 when the factory closed. Then he had another idea. He searched for environmental violations, EPA complaints, and he found it in 2004, 3 years after Lily's disappearance. Arthur Blackwood's development company had been slapped with a massive fine. An anonymous tip had led environmental inspectors to the Sparrow Creek Lane property. They'd found decades of illegally dumped industrial waste, hazardous materials, and one overflowing, toxic dumpster. As part of the cleanup order, Blackwood's company was required to have all waste from the site professionally removed and incinerated by a licensed hazardous materials disposal company. It was a dead end. Worse than a dead end. The evidence had been burned. Miles slumped in his chair, the hope draining out of him, replaced by a cold, bitter despair. He had been so close. He stared at the screen, at the environmental report. He read the name of the disposal company, Tri-State Hazmat Solutions. He read the details of the cleanup. They had documented everything, photographed the site before and after, and then he saw the line item that made his heart stop. Appendix C. Inventory of non-hazardous materials removed for separate disposal. He clicked the link. It was a long, boring list of items. Rotted wood, discarded furniture, and then, a single line. Item 47. Sealed container, 55-gallon drum, steel, contents unknown, origin. Blackwood Textiles dumpster, disposed of at North Ridge Municipal Landfill, Sector G, DA. Hadn't incinerated everything. A sealed steel drum, pulled from the dumpster, had been sent to the regular landfill. Why? Maybe it was too heavy. Maybe they assumed it was just more industrial junk. It didn't matter. It hadn't been burned. It had been buried. The plot twist wasn't a diary or a recording. It was a line item in a 20-year-old environmental report. A bureaucratic oversight. A miracle. Miles stood up, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. He walked straight into Captain Walsh's office without knocking. "I need an excavation warrant," he said, his voice ringing with an authority Walsh had never heard from him before. Walsh looked up from his paperwork, annoyed. "A what? Corbin, have you lost your mind?" "For the Parker case. We don't have a body, we don't have a weapon." "I know where the murder weapon is," Miles said, his eyes burning with intensity. "And I know where the proof is. It's in a 55-gallon steel drum, and it's been buried under 20 years of garbage at the North Ridge landfill. And I'm going to go dig it up." He laid the environmental report on Walsh's desk, his finger pointing to the line item. Walsh read it, his eyes widening. He read it again. He looked up at Miles, at the raw, obsessive certainty on his detective's face. For the first time, Walsh saw past the potential PR story and saw the truth. This was real. "My God, Miles," he whispered. "What do you think is in that drum? Asterisk." "Think," Miles said, his voice low and cold. "It's the little white trash bag that Arthur Blackwood threw away 23 years ago. And I think it contains Lily Parker's notebook, her keys, her wallet, and the clothes she was wearing the day he killed her. The full conspiracy wasn't just that Blackwood had killed a girl. It was that he had been so arrogant, so sure of his own power, that he had literally thrown the evidence of his crime into the trash, believing the world would simply carry it away and bury it for him. And it had. But he had made one mistake. He hadn't counted on a scared skinny kid who fed stray cats. And he hadn't counted on a detective who refused to let a ghost stay buried. The stakes had just shifted from a personal hunt to a public exhumation. The tension was at its absolute peak. The next move was to bring in the shovels and see what secrets the earth had been keeping. The North Ridge landfill was a monument to forgetting. It rose in great grassy mesas against the skyline, a landscape built from the city's discarded history. The air was thick with the sweet, cloying smell of decay, and the screech of gulls circling overhead. Getting the warrant had been a battle, but Walsh, seeing the abyss open up beneath the case, had pushed it through. The media had gotten wind of it, and now a line of news vans was parked a half-mile away, their satellite dishes aimed at the sky like expectant worshippers. The excavation began at dawn. A team of forensic specialists in white hazmat suits moved across Sector G, a grid laid out with stakes and string. An excavator, its massive yellow arm looking like a praying mantis, began to scrape away the earth, layer by layer. 20 years of compacted refuse, 20 years of secrets. Miles stood on the edge of the dig site, a grim sentinel in the morning chill. He hadn't slept. Arthur Blackwood was at his office, carrying on with his day as if nothing was happening. His lawyer had already called, protesting the baseless and harassing fishing expedition. Blackwood was still playing the part of the outraged victim. But Miles could feel the man's invisible eyes on them, could feel his panic beginning to curdle. His arrogance. Hours passed. The excavator dug deeper, pulling up layers of plastic bags, rotted furniture, and the detritus of a million forgotten lives. It was a slow, disgusting, and hopeless task. The forensic team sifted through every bucket, their faces grim. By midday, morale was low. Walsh was on the phone, getting hammered by the "They're giving us until sunset, Miles," Walsh said, his face strained. "If we don't find that drum by then, they're pulling the plug. The political pressure is massive. Blackwood is calling every friend he has in the state Senate." Miles just nodded, his eyes fixed on the pit. He could feel it. They were close. He walked over to the forensic lead, a woman named Dr. Aris Thorne, her face smudged with dirt. "Anything?" he asked. She shook her head. "It's a needle in a continent of haystacks. Detective, the ground shifts. Records from 20 years ago. They're not GPS coordinates." Just then, the excavator operator shouted. The engine died, and a sudden silence fell over the site, broken only by the wind and the gulls. The machine's bucket was poised in the air. Clamped in its metal teeth was a large cylindrical object, rusted and brown, a 55-gallon steel drum. A collective gasp went through the crew. Dr. Thorne ran to the edge of the pit. "Gently," she yelled. "Set it down gently." The operator, with surprising delicacy, lowered the drum to the ground. It was dented, corroded, but intact. The lid was still sealed. The cinematic payoff had arrived. This was the moment. The courtroom bombshell, unearthed from a grave of garbage. The hazmat team carefully moved the drum to a portable containment tent. The news helicopters were buzzing overhead now, vultures circling a kill. Miles, Walsh, and Dr. Thorne stepped inside the tent. The air was sterile, lit by harsh halogen lamps. "We're going to cut it open," Dr. Thorne said, her voice tight with anticipation. A technician with a plasma cutter approached the drum. The hiss and bright blue flare of the torch filled the tent. The smell of hot rusted metal was sharp and acrid. They cut a square section out of the top. The technician lifted the piece away. Dr. Thorne peered inside, a high-powered flashlight in her hand. She was silent for a long, agonizing moment. "My God," she whispered. She looked up at Miles, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and discovery. "It's preserved. The lack of oxygen, ... It's like a time capsule." She reached in with a pair of long tongs and began to pull items out, placing them carefully on a sterile white cloth. First, a spiral-bound notebook with a faded, warped image of a kitten on the cover. Lily's diary. Next, a set of keys on a simple silver ring. One for a car, one for a house. Then, a small leather wallet. Inside, a school ID with a smiling 17-year-old Lily Parker staring out frozen in time. A few dollars, a ticket stub, for a movie she never got to see. And finally, folded at the bottom of the drum, a set of clothes, a pair of jeans, a t-shirt with a local band's logo on it. They were stiff, stained, but recognizable, and inside the drum, at the very bottom, was a small white plastic trash bag, the one Kev had described. Dr. Thorne carefully opened it. The contents were what was left of Lily's last meal. A half-eaten bag of chips. A soda can. But wrapped inside a napkin was something else. A clump of dark hair, and a single ornate gold cufflink, bearing the initial B, Blackwood's. It was over. Miles felt a wave of dizziness, a profound bone-deep relief that was so intense it was almost painful. He had it. The DNA on the cufflink, the fingerprints that might still be preserved on the notebook. The sheer, undeniable fact of these items existing. It was the nail in Arthur Blackwood's coffin. The arrest was a public spectacle. Just as Walsh had wanted, but not for the reasons he'd hoped. Miles didn't wait for a warrant. He drove from the landfill straight to Blackwood's gleaming downtown office tower. He walked past the receptionist, past Blackwood's personal assistant, and kicked open the door to his corner office. Arthur Blackwood was on the phone, his back to the door, looking out at the city he owned. He turned, his face a mask of controlled fury. "I will have your badge for this, Corbin. This is harassment." "It's over, Arthur," Miles said, his voice quiet, deadly. He walked to the desk and placed the gold cufflink on the polished mahogany surface. Blackwood stared at the cufflink. For the first time, the mask slipped. The blood drained from his face. He saw not a piece of jewelry, but a ghost. He saw the end of his life. "We found the drum," Miles said. "We found her diary. We found everything." Blackwood didn't speak. He just stared at the cufflink, his carefully constructed world collapsing. Around him, in silent, screaming shards, the uniformed officers, led by Rivas, entered the room. "Arthur Blackwood," Rivas said, his voice ringing with the formal cadence of the law. "You are under arrest for the murder of Lily Ann Parker." As they cuffed him, Blackwood looked at Miles. His eyes were no longer cold and controlled. They were filled with a wild cornered animal hatred. "You," he spat. "The nobody detective. You couldn't just leave it alone." "She wasn't a nobody," Miles said, his voice like ice. "Her name was Lily." The image of the powerful, untouchable Arthur Blackwood being led in handcuffs through his own opulent office lobby was the lead story on every news channel that night. The public exposure was total, the downfall absolute. It wasn't just an arrest. It was the toppling of an idol, the revelation of the rot beneath the gilded surface of the city. For Mary Parker, watching on her small television, it was a catharsis. So profound it felt like a physical blow, a release of 23 years of pent-up rage and grief. For Kev Mulligan, it was the sound of a cage door swinging open. And for Miles Corbin, it was the deafening silence of a promise finally kept. The ghost of the albatross had finally come home. The trial was a formality. Faced with the mountain of evidence from the drum, and Kev Mulligan's quiet, unshakable testimony, Arthur Blackwood's high-priced lawyers could do nothing. The diary was the most damning witness of all. The last entry, written in the van just moments before Blackwood appeared, was read aloud in the silent courtroom. September 10th found the most beautifully tragic place today. The old textile factory. It feels like a sleeping giant, a fallen king. There's so much sadness here, but it's beautiful. I think I could spend all day just drawing the rust. It looks like the building is weeping. The words, so full of innocent artistic wonder, hung in the air, a heartbreaking testament to the life that had been stolen. Blackwood was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The public justice was served, cold and absolute. But the emotional aftermath was a quieter, more complicated affair. 6 months after the verdict, Miles drove to the cemetery. He found the Parker family plot. There were 2 headstones. Mary, who had finally found peace a month after the trial, her body giving out now that her fight was over, and Frank, his grave now tended and green. And between them was a new stone, small and simple. Lily Ann Parker, 198420001. She saw beauty in EVR Wyatt Tyngeme. Miles stood there for a long time, the wind rustling the leaves of the oak tree overhead. He had won. He had brought the monster to justice. But the victory felt hollow. It couldn't bring her back. It couldn't erase the 23 years of pain her parents had endured. It couldn't undo the silence that had consumed Kev Mulligan's life. He placed a single, fresh seafoam green carnation on her grave. It was a color he would never be able to see again without feeling a pang of sorrow. He had promised to find her, and he had. But the search had unearthed more than just a killer. It had unearthed the haunting truth of how easily a life can be discarded, how quickly the world can look away, and how long a secret can fester in the dark. The Google Street View car had been a random, digital ghost, accidentally shining a light into a forgotten corner. It was a reminder that even in a world of total surveillance, justice is never guaranteed. It still requires someone who is willing to look, someone who is willing to remember that as he turned to leave, he saw a figure standing by the cemetery gate. It was Kev Mulligan. He was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. He looked different. The hunted, haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet calm. He walked over to Miles. "I come here sometimes," Kev said, his voice steady, "to talk to her, to apologize for being a coward." "You weren't a coward, Kev," Miles said. "You were a kid, you survived." Kev nodded, a small, sad smile on his face. "I'm taking classes now, at the community college vet tech. I figured, after all this, I should do something for the cats." They stood in silence for a moment, 2 survivors of a war that had ended long ago. The cost of the truth had been immense. It had cost Lily her life, her parents, their happiness, Kev, his youth, and Miles a piece of his own soul. The Google car had updated its images of Sparrow Creek Lane. The alley was still there. But now it was clean. The derelict warehouse had been torn down, replaced by a neat, empty lot waiting for a new building, a new story. The albatross, after being meticulously processed by forensics, had been released to what was left of the Parker estate and was now sitting in the police impound lot, a relic no one knew what to do with. It was over. But the emotional echo would linger forever. Miles knew that for the rest of his life, he would be unable to scroll through the digital streets of his city without thinking of the ghosts that lay hidden just around the corner, waiting for a random click of a mouse to bring their stories back into the light. He had closed the case, but the haunting reflection remained. How many other vans were parked behind how many other abandoned buildings? Waiting patiently in the pixelated silence. The world was full of forgotten alleys, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would never be able to stop looking.